On a Friday, this is when we normally talk books, and I want to talk about a book called The Death of a Soldier Told by His Sister. It is by Olesya Khromeychuk, who is a historian, an academic, born in the Ukraine in Lviv, who now lives in London, where she's director of the Ukrainian Institute there. She's obviously very well informed in her history. She's obviously articulate and an extremely good writer, given that academic background. But this is a very personal, very intimate, and very intense story about her brother Vladimir, or Volodya, as the family called him, who died at the age of 42 in the Ukrainian armed forces in 2017 in Luhansk. Now take that year in. Most of us think about Russia's war against Ukraine as beginning in 2022. It's been going on for a little bit more than a year and a half now. That's what we think of. This book makes it very clear. This all began a long time sooner. It began with the invasion of Crimea in 2014, and thereafter Putin started supporting militias in the eastern area of Ukraine that we now know, in Luhansk and Donetsk, those areas that are so familiar to us. He put in mercenaries. He put in people of Russian forces origin who didn't have uniforms. He was destabilizing the area. It was a Russian invasion in all but name. And the Ukrainian army mobilized to fight a war there, and they had been doing so for about 4 years before the actual war began. Well, no more. For 7 years before the actual war that we know it began. So that's the first powerful point she makes in this book. My brother died in armed action well before the West was even caring or concerned about what amounted to a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it's a really strong and intimate memoir of that experience of having a brother die. And one of the points she makes is about that word die. She says, why do we say people die in action? Why do we say people die in wars? When you talk about die, it's normally about disease. It's normally about age. It's normally about an accident. You don't die in a war. You're killed or you're murdered. Why do we use such passive and polite language? And that's one of the points she makes. She makes another point about the need for it to be heroic, how her brother had an obituary in the local newspaper saying he died heroically defending his homeland. And she said, no, he didn't. I found out he was just in a trench. And the bloke who was next to him said, I was chatting to him 1 minute, I turned around, heard an explosion, and he was dead. She said there was nothing inherently heroic in the act, but the military authorities needed to make it heroic to justify his loss. And she penetrates deep into every entrail of the loss. What is remarkable is how little bitterness there is about Russia and Russians in this book. She's clearly outraged by what's happened to her homeland and distraught at what happened to her brother. But she doesn't really go after the Russians in a way that I expected her to. It's more about her personal emotions, her relations with this older brother who had a troubled history. And again, she said in his obituary, he's painted almost like a saint, and she said he wasn't. He had difficulties. He had addiction issues. He went overseas, couldn't make it, went home. He had darkness. He had depression. She said he was a flawed man who, because he died in this way, gets elevated to a degree of almost sainthood. But what is interesting is how jacked and efficient and calm and supportive the Ukrainian authorities were. She came back from London following the death of her brother. She's met at the railway station by 2 officials from the Ukrainian army who look after her, who say, this is where the funeral's going to be. These are the details. Can we help you? This is how we recommend you go about this. Is there anything you need? The state were incredibly supportive. They backed the family of the man who chose. He wasn't conscripted. He chose to go and fight. It's a really good story. It's powerful. It's intimate. It can be a little bit frustrating and repetitive in the way that it's written. It shows that some of this was an article before, published on its own. So there's a little bit of a lack of coherence in the story. But the personal insights into losing a brother at war, and the personal insights into the people of Ukraine. And she said, the offence I take, and she's interviewed by a lot of people as the main Ukraine war starts, because she's an expert in London, and she's a historian, and she's articulate. She says, the offence I take at when people justify Putin's arguments, when they say things, oh, Ukraine's not really a country. Aren't you really Russian? Doesn't he have a case here? She says, imagine if your country was questioned in that way after it was brutally invaded. The people's starting point is, oh, they're justified. And she talks with real, almost irrational anger about that in a way that I like. You're entitled to be irrational about that, given what was happening to her country. But it's important to understand that this has been going on for a long time, and Ukrainians were dying from as long ago as 2015 in their thousands at Russian hands, or at the hands of Russian militia. It's a good story. It's short. It's only 200 pages. It's an easy read, if you can say such a traumatic and emotional thing is easy. The book is The Death of a Soldier Told by His Sister by Olesya Khromeychuk. It's published by Monterey, and it gave me a real understanding into two things: the background of the Ukrainian confrontation and the mythology and the sort of distorted emotions around people being killed in wartime.